World War III or the Third World War, often abbreviated as World War III or WWIII, are names given to a hypothetical worldwide large-scale military conflict subsequent to World War I and World War II. The term has been in use since at least as early as 1941. Some apply it loosely to limited or more minor conflicts such as the Cold War or the War on Terror. In contrast, others assume that such a conflict would surpass prior world wars in both scope and destructive impact. Due to the development of nuclear weapons in the Manhattan Project, which were used in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki near the end of World War II, and their subsequent acquisition and deployment by many countries afterwards, the potential risk of a nuclear apocalypse causing widespread destruction of Earth's civilization and life is a common theme in speculations about a Third World War. Another primary concern is that biological warfare could cause many casualties. It could happen intentionally or inadvertently, by an accidental release of a biological agent, the unexpected mutation of an agent, or its adaptation to other species after use. Large-scale apocalyptic events like these, caused by advanced technology used for destruction, could render most of Earth's surface uninhabitable. Before the beginning of World War II in 1939, World War I was believed to have been the war to end wars. It was popularly believed that never again could there possibly be a global conflict of such magnitude. During the interwar period, World War I was typically referred to simply as the Great War. The outbreak of World War II disproved the hope that humanity might have outgrown the need for widespread global wars. With the advent of the Cold War in 1945 and with the spread of nuclear weapons technology to the Soviet Union, the possibility of a third global conflict increased. During the Cold War years, the possibility of a Third World War was anticipated and planned for by military and civil authorities in many countries. Scenarios ranged from conventional warfare to limited or total nuclear warfare. At the height of the Cold War, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, which determined that an all-out nuclear confrontation would destroy all of the states involved in the conflict, had been developed. The potential for absolute destruction of the human species may have contributed to the ability of both American and Soviet leaders to avoid such a scenario. The various global military conflicts that have occurred since the start of the 21st century, most recently the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, have been hypothesized as potential flashpoints or triggers for a Third World War. Etymology. I Magazine. None. Military plans. Military strategists have used war games to prepare for various war scenarios and to determine the most appropriate strategies. War games were utilized for World War I and World War II. Operation Unthinkable. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was concerned that, with the enormous size of Soviet Red Army forces deployed in Central and Eastern Europe at the end of World War II and the unreliability of the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, there was a serious threat to Western Europe. In April-May 1945, the British Armed Forces developed Operation Unthinkable, thought to be the first scenario of the Third World War. Its primary goal was to impose upon Russia the will of the United States and the British Empire. The plan was rejected by the British Chiefs of Staff Committee as militarily unfeasible. Operation Drop Shot. Operation Drop Shot was the 1950s United States contingency plan for a possible nuclear and conventional war with the Soviet Union in the Western European and Asian theaters. Although the scenario made use of nuclear weapons, they were not expected to play a decisive role. At the time, the U.S. nuclear arsenal was limited in size, based mostly in the United States, and depended on bombers for delivery. Drop Shot included mission profiles that would have used 300 nuclear bombs and 29,000 high-explosive bombs on 200 targets in 100 cities and towns to wipe out 85% of the Soviet Union's industrial potential at a single stroke. Between 75 and 100 of the 300 nuclear weapons were targeted to destroy Soviet combat aircraft on the ground. The scenario was devised prior to the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles. It was also devised before U.S. President John F. Kennedy and his Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara changed the U.S. nuclear war plan from the city-killing counter-value strike plan to a counter-force plan. Nuclear weapons at this time were not accurate enough to hit a naval base without destroying the city adjacent to it, so the aim in using them was to destroy the enemy's industrial capacity in an effort to cripple their war economy. British-Irish cooperation. Ireland started planning for a possible nuclear war as fears of a World War III began to haunt their Cold War foreign policy. Cooperation between Britain and Ireland would be formed in the event of World War III, where they would share weather data, control aids to navigation, and coordinate the wartime broadcasting service that would occur after a nuclear attack. Operation Sandstone in Ireland was a top-secret British-Irish military operation. The armed forces from both states began a new coastal survey of Britain and Ireland operating from 1948 to 1955. This was a request from the United States to identify suitable landing grounds for the U.S. in the event of a successful Soviet invasion. By 1953, the cooperation agreed upon sharing information on wartime weather and the evacuation of civilian refugees from Britain to Ireland. Ireland's Operation Sandstone was ended in 1966. Exercises Grand Slam, Long Step, and Main Brace. In January 1950, the North Atlantic Council approved NATO's military strategy of containment. NATO military planning took on a renewed urgency following the outbreak of the Korean War in the early 1950s, prompting NATO to establish a force under a centralized command, adequate to deter aggression and to ensure the defense of Western Europe. Allied Command Europe was established under General of the Army Dwight D. Eisenhower, U.S. Army, on April 2, 1951. The Western Union Defense Organization had previously carried out Exercise Verity, a 1949 multilateral exercise involving naval airstrikes and submarine attacks. Exercise Main Brace brought together 200 ships and over 50,000 personnel to practice the defense of Denmark and Norway from the Soviet attack in 1952. It was the first major NATO exercise. The exercise was jointly commanded by Supreme Allied Commander Atlantic Admiral Lindy D. McCormick, USN, and Supreme Allied Commander Europe General Matthew B. Ridgway, U.S. Army, during the autumn of 1952. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, Netherlands, and Belgium all participated. Exercises Grand Slam and Long Step were naval exercises held in the Mediterranean Sea during 1952 to practice dislodging an enemy occupying force and amphibious assault. It involved over 170 warships and 700 aircraft under the overall command of Admiral Robert B. Carney. The overall exercise commander, Admiral Carney, summarized the accomplishments of Exercise Grand Slam by stating, "We have demonstrated that the senior commanders of all four powers can successfully take charge of a mixed task force and handle it effectively as a working unit." The Soviet Union called the exercises warlike acts by NATO, with particular reference to the participation of Norway and Denmark, and prepared for its own military maneuvers in the Soviet zone. Exercise Strike Back. Exercise Strike Back was a major NATO naval exercise held in 1957, simulating a response to an all-out Soviet attack on NATO. The exercise involved over 200 warships, 650 aircraft, and 75,000 personnel from the United States Navy, the United Kingdom's Royal Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, the French Navy, the Royal Netherlands Navy, and the Royal Norwegian Navy. As the largest peacetime naval operation up to that time, Exercise Strikeback was characterized by military analyst Hanson W. Baldwin of the New York Times as constituting the strongest striking fleet assembled since World War II. Exercise Reforger. Exercise Reforger was an annual exercise conducted during the Cold War by NATO. While troops could easily fly across the Atlantic, the heavy equipment and armor reinforcements would have to come by sea and be delivered to POMCUS sites. These exercises tested the United States and Allied abilities to carry out transcontinental reinforcement. Timely reinforcement was a critical part of the NATO reinforcement exercises. The United States needed to be able to send active duty Army divisions to Europe within a 10-day period of receiving the notification. In addition to assessing the capabilities of the United States, Reforger also monitored the personnel, facilities, and equipment of the European countries playing a significant role in the reinforcement effort. The exercise was intended to ensure that NATO had the ability to quickly deploy forces to West Germany in the event of a conflict with the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact outnumbered NATO throughout the Cold War in conventional forces, especially armor. Therefore, in the event of a Soviet invasion, in order not to resort to tactical nuclear strikes, NATO forces holding the line against a Warsaw Pact armored spearhead would have to be quickly resupplied and replaced. Most of this support would have come across the Atlantic from North America. Reforger was not merely a show of force in the event of a conflict, it would be the actual plan to strengthen the NATO presence in Europe. In that instance, it would have been referred to as Operation Reforger. The political goals of Reforger were to promote extended deterrence and foster NATO cohesion. Important components in Reforger included the Military Airlift Command, the Military Sealift Command, and the Civil Reserve Air Fleet. 7 Days to the River Rhine. 7 Days to the River Rhine was a top-secret military simulation exercise developed in 1979 by the Warsaw Pact. It started with the assumption that NATO would launch a nuclear attack on the Vistula River Valley in a first strike scenario, which would result in as many as 2 million Polish civilian casualties. In response, a Soviet counter-strike would be carried out against West Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Denmark, with Warsaw Pact forces invading West Germany and aiming to stop at the River Rhine by the 7th day. Other USSR plans stopped only upon reaching the French border on day 9. Individual Warsaw Pact states were only assigned their own subpart of the strategic picture. In this case, the Polish forces were only expected to go as far as Germany. The 7 Days to the Rhine plan envisioned that Poland and Germany would be largely destroyed by nuclear exchanges, and that large numbers of troops would die of radiation sickness. It was estimated that NATO would fire nuclear weapons behind the advancing Soviet lines to cut off their supply lines and thus blunt their advance. While this plan assumed that NATO would use nuclear weapons to push back any Warsaw Pact invasion, it did not include nuclear strikes on France or the United Kingdom. Newspapers speculated when this plan was declassified, that France and the UK were not to be hit in an effort to get them to withhold the use of their own nuclear weapons. Exercise Able Archer. Exercise Able Archer was an annual exercise by the U.S. European Command that practiced command and control procedures, with emphasis on the transition from solely conventional operations to chemical, nuclear, and conventional operations during a time of war. Able Archer 83 was a 5-day North Atlantic Treaty Organization command post exercise starting on November 7, 1983, that spanned Western Europe, centered on the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe headquarters in Casto, north of the city of Mons. Able Archer exercises simulated a period of conflict escalation, culminating in a coordinated nuclear attack. The realistic nature of the 1983 exercise, coupled with deteriorating relations between the United States and the Soviet Union and the anticipated arrival of strategic Pershing II nuclear missiles in Europe, led some members of the Soviet Politburo and military to believe that Able Archer 83 was a ruse of war, obscuring preparations for a genuine nuclear first strike. In response, the Soviets readied their nuclear forces and placed air units in East Germany and Poland on alert. This 1983 war scare is considered by many historians to be the closest the world has come to nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The threat of nuclear war ended with the conclusion of the exercise on November 11, however. Strategic Defense Initiative. The Strategic Defense Initiative was proposed by U.S. President Ronald Reagan on March 23, 1983. In the latter part of his presidency, numerous factors had turned Ronald Reagan against the concept of winnable nuclear war, and he began to see nuclear weapons as more of a wild card than a strategic deterrent. Although he later believed in disarmament treaties slowly blunting the danger of nuclear weaponry by reducing their number and alert status, he also believed a technological solution might allow incoming ICBMs to be shot down, thus making the U.S. invulnerable to a first strike. However, the USSR saw the SDI concept as a major threat, since a unilateral deployment of the system would allow the U.S. to launch a massive first strike on the Soviet Union without any fear of retaliation. The SDI concept was to use ground-based and space-based systems to protect the United States from attack by strategic nuclear ballistic missiles. The initiative focused on strategic defense rather than the prior strategic offense doctrine of mutually assured destruction. The Strategic Defense Initiative organization was set up in 1984 within the United States Department of Defense to oversee the Strategic Defense Initiative. NATO nuclear sharing. NATO operational plans for a Third World War have involved NATO allies who do not have their own nuclear weapons, using nuclear weapons supplied by the United States as part of a general NATO war plan, under the direction of NATO's Supreme Allied Commander. Of the three nuclear powers in NATO, only the United States has provided weapons for nuclear sharing. As of November 2009, Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands and Turkey are still hosting U.S. nuclear weapons as part of NATO's nuclear sharing policy. Canada hosted weapons until 1984, and Greece until 2001. The United Kingdom also received U.S. tactical nuclear weapons such as nuclear artillery and Lance missiles until 1992. Despite the UK being a nuclear weapons state in its own right, these were mainly deployed in Germany. In peacetime, the nuclear weapons stored in non-nuclear countries are guarded by U.S. airmen, though previously some artillery and missile systems were guarded by U.S. Army soldiers. The codes required for detonating them are under American control. In case of war, the weapons are to be mounted on the participating country's warplanes. The weapons are under custody and control of U.S. Air Force Munitions Support Squadron CO located on NATO main operating bases who work together with the host nation forces. As of 2005, 180 tactical B-61 nuclear bombs of the 480 U.S. nuclear weapons believed to be deployed in Europe fall under the nuclear sharing arrangement. The weapons are stored within a vault in hardened aircraft shelters, using the U.S. Air Force WWIII weapon storage and security system. The delivery warplanes used are F-16 Fighting Falcons and Panavia Tornadoes. Historical close calls. With the initiation of the Cold War arms race in the 1950s, an apocalyptic war between the United States and the Soviet Union became a real possibility. During the Cold War era, a number of military events have been described as having come close to potentially triggering World War III. Korean War, June 25, 1950 and NBSP, July 27, 1953. None. Berlin Crisis, June 4 – November 9, 1961. The Berlin Crisis of 1961 was a political-military confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union at Checkpoint Charlie, with both a number of American and Soviet/East German tanks and troops at standoff at each other only 100 yards on either side of the checkpoint. The reason behind the confrontation was about the occupational status of the German capital city, Berlin, and of post-World War II Germany. The Berlin crisis started when the USSR launched an ultimatum demanding the withdrawal of all armed forces from Berlin, including the Western armed forces in West Berlin. The crisis culminated in the city's de facto partition with the East German erection of the Berlin Wall. This standoff ended peacefully on October 28 following a US-Soviet understanding to withdraw tanks and reduce tensions. Cuban Missile Crisis, 1529 October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis, a confrontation on the stationing of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba in response to the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, is considered as having been the closest to a nuclear exchange, which could have precipitated a Third World War. The crisis peaked on October 27, with 3 separate major incidents occurring on the same day. The most critical incident occurred when a Soviet submarine nearly launched a nuclear-tipped torpedo in response to having been targeted by American naval depth charges in international waters, with the Soviet nuclear launch response only having been prevented by Soviet Navy Executive Officer Vasily Arkhipov. The shooting down of a Lockheed U-2 spy plane piloted by Rudolf Anderson while violating Cuban airspace. The near interception of another U-2 that had somehow managed to stray into Soviet airspace over Siberia, which airspace violation nearly caused the Soviets to believe that this might be the vanguard of a U.S. aerial bombardment. Despite what many believe to be the closest the world has come to a nuclear conflict, throughout the entire standoff, the doomsday clock, which is run by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists to estimate how close the end of the world, or doomsday, is, with midnight being the apocalypse, stayed at a relatively stable 7 minutes to midnight. This has been explained as being due to the brevity of the crisis, since the clock monitored more long-term factors such as leadership of countries, conflicts, wars, and political upheavals, as well as society's reactions to said factors. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists now credits the political developments resulting from the Cuban Missile Crisis with having actually enhanced global stability. The Bulletin posits that future crises and occasions that might otherwise escalate, were rendered as more stable due to 2 major factors. A Washington to Moscow direct telephone line resulted from the communication trouble between the White House and the Kremlin during the crisis, giving the leaders of the 2 largest nuclear powers the ability to contact each other in real time, rather than sending written messages that needed to be translated and wired, which had dragged out conversations in which seconds could have potentially prevented a nuclear exchange. The second factor was caused in part due to the worldwide reaction to how close the US and USSR had come to the brink of World War III during the standoff. As the public began to more closely monitor topics involving nuclear weapons, and therefore to rally support for the cause of non-proliferation, the 1963 Test Ban Treaty was signed. To date, this treaty has been signed by 126 total nations, with the most notable exceptions being France and China. Both of these countries were still in the relative beginning stages of their nuclear programs at the time of the original treaty signing, and both sought nuclear capabilities independent of their allies. This test ban treaty prevented the testing of nuclear ordnance that detonated in the atmosphere, limiting nuclear weapons testing to below ground and underwater, decreasing fallout and effects on the environment, and subsequently caused the doomsday clock to decrease by 5 minutes, to arrive at a total of 12 minutes to midnight. Up until this point, over 1,000 nuclear bombs had been detonated, and concerns over both long and short-term effects to the planet became increasingly more worrisome to scientists. Sino-Soviet border conflicts, March 2–September 11, 1969. The Sino-Soviet border conflict was a 7-month undeclared military border war between the Soviet Union and China at the height of the Sino-Soviet split in 1969. The most serious of these border clashes, which brought the world's 2 largest communist states to the brink of war, occurred in March 1969 in the vicinity of Genbeo Island on the Ushiri River, near Manchuria. The conflict resulted in a ceasefire, with a return to the status quo. Critics point out that the Chinese attack on Genbeo was to deter any potential future Soviet invasions, that by killing some Soviets, China demonstrated that it could not be bullied, and that Mao wanted to teach them a bitter lesson. China's relations with the USSR remained sour after the conflict, despite the border talks, which began in 1969 and continued inconclusively for a decade. Domestically, the threat of war caused by the border clashes inaugurated a new stage in the Cultural Revolution, that of China's thorough militarization. The 9th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, held in the aftermath of the Genbeo Island incident, confirmed Defense Minister Lin Biao as Mao Zedong's heir apparent. Following the events of 1969, the Soviet Union further increased its forces along the Sino-Soviet border, and in the Mongolian People's Republic. Yom Kippur War superpower tensions, 6-25 October 1973. The Yom Kippur War, also known as the Ramadan War, or October War, began with Arab victories. Israel successfully counterattacked. Tensions grew between the US and the Soviet Union. American and Soviet naval forces came close to firing upon each other in Mediterranean Sea. Admiral Daniel J. Murphy of the U.S. Sixth Fleet reckoned the chances of the Soviet squadron attempting a first strike against his fleet at 40%. The Pentagon moved defense status from 4 to 3. The superpowers had been pushed to the brink of war, but tensions eased with the ceasefire brought in under UNSC 339. NORAD computer error of 1979, November 9, 1979. The United States made emergency retaliation preparations after NORAD saw on-screen indications that a full-scale Soviet attack had been launched. No attempt was made to use the Red telephone hotline to clarify the situation with the USSR, and it was not until early warning radar systems confirmed no such launch had taken place that NORAD realized that a computer system test had caused the display errors. A senator inside the NORAD facility at the time described an atmosphere of absolute panic. A Gao investigation led to the construction of an off-site test facility to prevent similar mistakes. Soviet radar malfunction, September 26, 1983. A false alarm occurred on the Soviet nuclear early warning system, showing the launch of American LGM-30 Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles from bases in the United States. A retaliatory attack was prevented by Stanislav Petrov, a Soviet Air Defense Forces officer, who realized the system had simply malfunctioned. Able Archer escalations, 2/11 November 1983. During Able Archer 83, a 10-day NATO exercise simulating a period of conflict escalation that culminated in a Defcon 1 nuclear strike, some members of the Soviet Politburo and armed forces treated the events as a ruse of war concealing a genuine first strike. In response, the military prepared for a coordinated counterattack by readying nuclear forces and placing air units stationed in the Warsaw Pact states of East Germany and Poland under high alert. However, the state of Soviet preparation for retaliation ceased upon completion of the Able Archer exercises. Norwegian rocket incident, January 25, 1995. The Norwegian rocket incident was the first World War III close call to occur outside the Cold War. This incident occurred when Russia's Olnogorsk early warning station accidentally mistook the radar signature from a Black Brant 12 research rocket, as appearing to be the radar signature of the launch of a Trident SLBM missile. In response, Russian President Boris Yeltsin was summoned and the Kagat nuclear briefcase was activated for the first and only time. However, the High Command was soon able to determine that the rocket was not entering Russian airspace, and promptly aborted plans for combat readiness and retaliation. It was retrospectively determined that, while the rocket scientists had informed 30 states including Russia about the test launch, the information had not reached Russian radar technicians. Incident at Pristina Airport, June 12, 1999. On June 12, 1999, the day following the end of the Kosovo War, some 250 Russian peacekeepers occupied the Pristina International Airport ahead of the arrival of NATO troops and were to secure the arrival of reinforcements by air. American NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe General Wesley Clark ordered the use of force against the Russians. Mike Jackson, a British Army general who contacted the Russians during the incident, refused to enforce Clark's orders, famously telling him, "I'm not going to start the Third World War for you." Captain James Blunt, the lead officer at the front of the NATO column in the direct armed standoff against the Russians, received the destroy orders from Clark over the radio, but he followed Jackson's orders to encircle the airfield instead and later said in an interview that even without Jackson's intervention he would have refused to follow Clark's order. Current conflicts. Russian invasion of Ukraine, February 24, 2022 present. On February 24, 2022, Russia's President Vladimir Putin ordered a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, marking a major escalation of the Russo-Ukrainian War, which began in 2014. The invasion has been described as the largest military conflict in Europe since World War II. The invasion received widespread international condemnation, including new sanctions imposed on Russia, which notably included Russia's ban from SWIFT and the closing of most Western airspace to Russian planes. Moreover, both prior to and during the invasion, some of the 30 member states of NATO have been providing Ukraine with arms and other materiel support. Throughout the invasion, several senior Russian politicians, including President Putin and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, have made a number of statements widely seen as threatening the use of nuclear weapons, while several officials from the United States and NATO, including U.S. President Joe Biden and NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, have made statements reaffirming NATO's response in the event that Russia attacks any NATO member state or uses nuclear weapons, while also reiterating the need to prevent the crisis from escalating into a potential Third World War. Moreover, on November 15, 2022, one or more missiles struck the territory of Poland at the village of Prziełów near the border with Ukraine, killing 2 people. It was the first incident of a missile landing and exploding within NATO territory. Despite initial statements regarding a close call to a conflict between Russia and NATO, the United States found that the missile was likely to have been an air defense missile fired by Ukrainian forces at an incoming Russian missile. Various experts, analysts, and others have described the crisis as a close call to a Third World War, while others have suggested the contrary. Extended usage of the term Cold War. As Soviet-American relations grew more tense in the post-World War II period, the fear that it could escalate into World War III was ever present. A Gallup poll in December 1950 found that more than half of Americans considered World War III to have already started. In 2004, commentator Norman Podhoretz proposed that the Cold War, lasting from the surrender of the Axis powers until the fall of the Berlin Wall, might rightly be called World War III. By Podhoretz's reckoning, World War IV would be the global campaign against Islamofascism. Still, the majority of historians would seem to hold that World War III would necessarily have to be a worldwide war in which large forces from many countries fought, and a war that involves most of the principal nations of the world. The Cold War received its name from the lack of action taken from both sides. The lack of action was out of fear that a nuclear war would possibly destroy humanity. In his book Secret Weapons of the Cold War, Bill Yen explains that the military standoff that occurred between the two superpowers, namely the United States and the Soviet Union, from the 1940s through to 1991, was only the Cold War, which ultimately helped to enable mankind to avert the possibility of an all-out nuclear confrontation, and that it certainly was not World War III. War on Terror. The War on Terror that began with the September 11 attacks has been claimed by some to be World War III or sometimes as World War IV. Others have disparaged such claims as distorting American history. While there is general agreement amongst historians regarding the definitions and extent of the first two world wars, namely due to the unmistakable global scale of aggression and self-destruction of these two wars, a few have claimed that a world war might now no longer require such worldwide and large-scale aggression and carnage. Still, such claims of a new lower threshold of aggression, that might now be sufficient to qualify a war as a world war have not gained such widespread acceptance and support as the definitions of the first two world wars have received amongst historians. War on the Islamic State. Multiple small wars as a third war. In multiple recorded interviews under somewhat casual circumstances, comparing the conflagrations of World War I and II to the ongoing lower-intensity wars of the 21st century, Pope Francis has said, "The world is at war because it has lost peace, and perhaps one can speak of a third war, one fought piecemeal."